Hey guys, let's start with the story tonight. Curatorial assistant Leah was involved in a mystery while sorting out the shadowless posthumous works of the 19th century painter Edgar Vail, and ultimately did not inherit or destroy the core painting, but instead set strict viewing restrictions and wrote spiritual protection guidelines to protect the art of painting and restrain its emotional curse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me in the comments where you started tuning in and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see people from all over the world join us. The rain in Bay City always carries a briny smell, like cotton wool soaked by the sea, weighing heavily on the art museum's glass dome. Leah brushed the dust off the edge of the frame with her fingertip, feeling the fine sand embedded in the wood grain, a memento of the bay left by these 19th century relics as they passed from private collectors' hands. As a curatorial assistant, she had been working on the Forgotten Master of Light and Shadow special exhibition for 3 months, but at this moment, the painting before her suddenly made the air in her chest grow thick and stagnant. On the canvas stood a gentleman in a morning coat, leaning against the cast-iron railing of a pier, with churning mist and indistinct masts behind him. The brushwork was so delicate that one could see the down on the brim of his top hat. But when Leah's gaze fell to his feet, her heart skipped a beat. No shadow. It was not an oversight due to the angle of the light. Instead, the area where the shadow should have been was covered by a very faint, almost transparent layer of grayish-white paint, as if deliberately erased. Edgar Vail, 1832 to 1893. Morning Mist at the Pier, 1887. The words on the label were concise and cold, ending with a note. Disappeared on the night of his solo exhibition in 1893, whereabouts unknown. Leah frowned. She had sorted through Vail's biographical materials and only knew that he was a reclusive painter with very few works surviving. The 10 relics on display this time were treasures a collector had spent 20 years gathering. Never before had she heard that Vail's paintings were characterized by no shadows. She stood up and walked to the other side of the exhibition hall, examining the remaining paintings one by one. Portraits, landscapes, interior scenes, regardless of the composition, all living beings and inanimate objects in the paintings lacked shadows. In one painting depicting the backstage of a theater, an actress turned, lifting her skirt, but not a trace of a shadow was left on the ground, as if she were not standing on a real floor but floating in the gap between light and shadow on the canvas. Leah leaned closer to the frame, and the scent of old oil paint mixed with wood lingered at her nostrils. In a daze, she thought the mist in the painting was slowly flowing, and the actress's skirt seemed to flutter slightly. Leah, haven't you finished organizing yet? Closing time is almost here. The curator's voice came from the entrance of the exhibition hall, breaking her trance. Leah turned around and forced a smile. Curator, look at Vail's paintings. None of them have shadows. The curator approached and glanced briefly, his tone flat. I noticed that earlier. Perhaps it's his unique artistic style. These paintings are quite old, so handle them carefully. The exhibition opens next week. With that, he turned and left. His footsteps hurried, as if unwilling to linger in the hall any longer. Leah watched his retreating figure, her doubts growing stronger. A unique artistic style? This deliberate erasure of shadows carried an indescribable eeriness, far beyond a mere stylistic choice. She stood back in front of morning mist at the pier, trying to find answers in the brushwork, but the more she looked, the more she felt the mist in the painting pulling at her gaze, as if some unknown secret lay hidden behind that haze. That night, Leah dreamed of that pier for the first time. The mist was thicker than in the painting, dense as solidified milk, leaving a cold, damp trace on her fingertips when she reached out. The salty sea breeze, mixed with the stench of reefs, blew against her face. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was distant one moment, close the next, sometimes dull as a drumbeat, sometimes soft as a whisper. but the outline of the sea was never visible, as if the blue had been completely swallowed by the mist. She stood by the cast-iron railing, exactly where the gentleman in the painting had stood. The railing was covered with fine rust, cold enough to sting her fingertips, and dotted with droplets condensed from the mist. The wooden planks under her feet were dilapidated, creaking with every move, and dark green moss was embedded in the cracks, its slimy texture seeping through her thin socks, making every step cautious. There was no one else around, only the mist flowing slowly, so slowly it was barely perceptible, but she could clearly see the distant masts shifting position in the fog, fading from blurry black silhouettes to gray, blending with the mist, as if about to dissipate at any moment. She tried to walk forward, but each step felt like treading on cotton. The planks beneath her were clearly solid, yet she always had the illusion of falling. Her sense of direction collapsed instantly. No matter how long she walked toward the masts, when she turned around, that section of cast-iron railing was still faintly visible not far away, as if she were constantly going in circles, trapped in this foggy pier by an invisible boundary. She woke up with a start. The rain was still falling outside the window, and her pajamas were soaked with cold sweat, her heart pounding wildly. She grabbed her phone to check the time. It was 3 in the morning. The cold, damp feeling from the dream still lingered on her skin. She thought it was just a nightmare brought on by exhaustion from organizing the paintings during the day. But when the same dream recurred on the second and third nights, she realized it was no coincidence. On the third night's dream, she finally broke free from that circular pier area. The mist thinned slightly, allowing her to faintly make out the outlines of distant buildings, like silhouettes gnawed away by the fog. A narrow stone path stretched from the end of the pier, its stones polished smooth by time, with scattered seaweed growing in the cracks, damp with moisture, making it extremely slippery to walk on. She held onto the vague wall beside the path and moved forward slowly. The wall was covered with dark green ivy, and water droplets from the leaves fell on her shoulders, the cold seeping down her collar. After walking about 100 steps, she suddenly spotted a pocket watch lying in the middle of the stone path. Its brass case glowed faintly in the dim fog, carved with intricate interlocking patterns, and fine patina was embedded in the grooves, clearly having been around for a long time. She bent down to pick it up, and the moment her fingertip touched the case, a sharp chill spread through her body. Not ordinary cold, but a cold tinged with emotion, instantly soaking her limbs and making her hair stand on end. The watch's cover was tightly closed. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't open it. The glass over the dial was cloudy, and the hands were indistinguishable. Just as she tried to feel for the clasp on the case, the cold intensified abruptly. The sound of the waves in her ears suddenly turned sharp, and the fog spun wildly. The stone path and the wall in front of her twisted into blurry blobs of color, and the dream shattered like a torn canvas. Leah sat up abruptly, her chest heaving. The tactile sensation of the pocket watch still seemed to linger in her hand. She turned on the bedside lamp and searched the bed and the floor, but naturally, there was no sign of the watch. Yet that realistic feeling was no illusion from a dream. She pulled out her laptop and frantically searched for information about Edgar Vale, especially those who had studied his works in depth. The search results were scarce. Vale's life, like his disappearance, was shrouded in mystery. But in a 1957 academic journal article, Leah found a vague description. Vale's paintings possess a strange allure. Researchers often fall into recurring dreams, with dream scenes mostly featuring piers and fog from his works. Some experience temporary amnesia and disorientation. The author of the article was an art historian named Irene. Shortly after the article was published, Irene suddenly abandoned her research on Vale and vanished without a trace. Following the lead, Leah found the museum's old archives. At the bottom of a dusty filing cabinet, she pulled out a 1960 in-house logbook. One entry read, Ms. Irene White visited to request access to Vale's original paintings. After staying for 3 days, she suddenly suffered from amnesia, forgetting why she had come. When leaving, she repeatedly got lost and needed staff guidance to exit the museum. There was a handwritten note at the end of the entry. 2 previous scholars who studied Vale exhibited similar symptoms. A chill crept up her spine. Leah closed the filing cabinet and leaned against its cold surface, her mind in chaos. The recurring dreams, the scholar's abnormal symptoms, the missing shadows in the paintings. All clues pointed to Edgar Vale and the works he left behind before his disappearance. She had to find the answer, not only to solve the mystery, but also to put an end to the nightmares plaguing her. Early the next morning, Leah returned to the exhibition hall. This time, she didn't look at the paintings themselves but focused on the frames. She remembered the curator saying that these paintings had retained their original frames when acquired from private collectors. She took out a magnifying glass and carefully examined each frame, running her fingertips over the wood grain, carvings, and joints. Finally, in the interlayer of the frame of the painting depicting the theater backstage, she felt a thin piece of paper. She carefully pulled the paper out with tweezers. It was a yellowed letter, his handwriting elegant, the ink somewhat faded. There was no signature on the envelope, only a blurred date, July 15th, 1862. "My dearest Edgar," the letter began. "The doctor says I don't have much time left, but I'm not afraid of death. I only regret not being able to watch the sunrise over the bay with you anymore, or see you sketching light and shadow on the canvas. You always say there are stars in my eyes, but I want to say that there is life in your brush. Remember you said you would paint a full-length portrait of me, letting me stay in your paintings forever. Please promise me not to grieve too much for my passing. Carry my love and keep creating. By the way, my shadow only wishes to follow your brush. No matter where I go, it will stay on your canvas, accompanying you." There was no signature at the end of the letter, but Leah was almost certain that the writer was someone important in Vale's life. She carefully put the letter away and continued to check other frames. In the interlayer of a portrait, she found a leather-bound diary, its cover worn, with Edgar Vale's name written on the title page. The diary entries began in 1859. The handwriting, initially brisk and fluent, gradually became heavy and scribbled, and the writing on the last few pages was even distorted, reflecting the pain and struggle in the writer's heart. Leah sat on a bench in the exhibition hall, flipping through the pages one by one. Vale's life and secrets unfolded before her like a painting. In the spring of 1859, the young Vale had come to Bay City's theater to apply for a job as a set painter, carrying his sketchbook on his back. At that time, he was wearing a faded shirt with his sleeves rolled up to his forearms, clutching a few sketches, standing awkwardly in the corner of the backstage. But the moment he looked up, his gaze was captivated by the figure on the stage. That was Celeste. As Zerlina, she wore a goose-yellow skirt, her singing as clear as a nightingale. The arc of her skirt as she turned cast a soft shadow under the stage lights. At that moment, the brush in Vale's hand moved instinctively, quickly sketching her outline, even capturing the changes in light and shadow on the stage with precision. After the performance, he lingered, holding his sketches, but Celeste took the initiative to call him over. Looking at the sketch of herself, her eyes lit up like stars. "Your brush understands me better than the stage lights." They quickly fell in love. Vale's studio was in an alley near the theater. Whenever Celeste had free time, she would go to accompany him, sometimes sitting by the window watching him paint, the sunlight falling on her hair, casting a clear shadow on the canvas. Sometimes singing an opera aria for him, and Vale would add strokes to the paper to the rhythm of her voice. He painted countless sketches of Celeste, her reading a letter in the morning light, picking roses in the garden, leaning on his shoulder asleep. Each sketch was meticulous, and in every one, she smiled brightly, her shadow varying under the sun, lights, and moonlight, yet always vivid and warm. Vale wrote in his diary, "Celeste's appearance has made me understand the meaning of light and shadow. She is the source of inspiration for all my paintings, and the only light in my life." In the summer of 1862, a sudden lung illness struck Celeste. At first, it was just a mild cough, but gradually, even standing on stage became difficult. Her once bright smile was worn away by illness, leaving only pale exhaustion. Vale put aside all his work and stayed by her bedside day and night, wiping the cold sweat from her forehead, reading her his diary, and placing her favorite roses on the windowsill, hoping the fragrance would comfort her. He still insisted on painting her, but the Celeste on the paper grew thinner and thinner, the light in her eyes fading day by day. Yet he still carefully sketched her shadow, as if keeping the shadow would keep her. But fate was unrelenting. On the day Celeste died, it poured rain in Bay City. The rain beat against the roof and windows with a dull sound, as if mourning the parting. Vale held her cold body and sat in the cemetery all night. The rain soaked his clothes, but he was oblivious, only stroking her hair repeatedly, whispering the words she had once said. This page of the diary was soaked by both tears and rain. The handwriting blurred, only fragmentary phrases like, "lost the light," "no shadow left," and "the canvas can't hold you," distinguishable. On the day of the funeral, he placed a sketch of Celeste smiling in her coffin. In that sketch, her shadow was particularly clear under the setting sun. It was the last time he could keep her shadow in a painting. After Celeste's burial, Vale returned to his studio and painted frantically. He wanted to capture Celeste's final appearance, but when he picked up his brush and poured all his grief onto the canvas, he found that the Celeste in the painting had no shadow. He thought he was hallucinating from excessive grief, but no matter how many times he revised it, the shadow never appeared. It wasn't until late one night, as he stared blankly at the painting in his studio, that he suddenly realized it was his grief that had stripped Celeste of her shadow on the canvas. This realization plunged Vale into shock and ecstasy. He began to experiment with infusing emotion into other paintings, discovering that as long as his emotions were intense enough, he could peel off the subject's emotional shadow, those invisible emotional burdens hidden deep in the heart, and fix them in a special layer of oil paint on the canvas. As a result, the figures in the paintings lost their physical shadows, becoming ethereal and light, while the real-life models, after the painting was completed, would feel an unprecedented sense of relief. The long-suppressed pain and sorrow seemed to fade away with the emotional shadow, offering temporary release. Vale gradually became obsessed with this ability. He began actively seeking out models burdened by trauma to paint their portraits. He could keenly detect the pain hidden behind their smiles and the despair in their silence, absorbing all these emotions into his paintings. Each completed work meant he had absorbed another person's emotions, while his own emotional reserves were constantly depleted. He wrote in his diary, "I am like an empty vessel, able to survive only by devouring the emotions of others. I can no longer feel my own sorrow or joy. Only when the brush moves across the canvas can I confirm that I am still alive." The diary entries became increasingly sparse, the handwriting more scribbled. After 1889, only fragmented phrases remained, mostly desperate cries about emotional exhaustion and needing more shadows. The last entry was dated October 15th, 1893, the night before Vale's solo exhibition, and it contained only one sentence: "Only by becoming art itself can one attain eternity." Leah closed the diary, her fingertips cold. She finally understood. Vale's paintings were not mere works of art, but grand emotional sacrifices. The missing shadows were the weight of others' emotions. The strange allure of the paintings was the pull of Vale's remaining consciousness. And her recurring dreams were likely fragments of Vale's consciousness scattered across his works, unconsciously drawing her into the emotional labyrinth he had constructed. At that moment, she suddenly remembered the pocket watch from her dream. She immediately got up and went to the museum's collection vault, finding the elderly staff member in charge of collections and asking if there was a pocket watch among Edgar Vale's belongings. The staff member looked stunned for a moment, then turned and retrieved a velvet box from the safe. When he opened it, inside was a brass pocket watch, its patterns identical to the one she had seen in her dream, its dial blurred beyond recognition. "This came with Vale's relics when we acquired them," the staff member explained. "It said he carried it with him at all times. Since it's not a painting, it wasn't put on display. Strangely enough, no matter how many times it's been repaired, it won't run, as if locked by some force." Leah picked up the pocket watch. The moment her fingertip touched the case, the familiar chill spread again. A blurry image flashed through her mind. Vale sitting in his studio, holding the pocket watch, staring blankly at the fog outside the window. Celeste's smile flickered before his eyes, then vanished into the mist. She snapped back to reality, the pocket watch still in her hand, but that image had been so clear, as if she had experienced it firsthand. "Excuse me," Leah suddenly asked. "Was there a painting called Self-Portrait Empty Easel in Vale's solo exhibition?" The staff member frowned, thinking for a moment. "I think there's a record of it, but it was never displayed. After Vale disappeared, it vanished. Some say he took it with him. Others say it was hidden." Leah's heart sank. She remembered the scene in her dream. Every time she reached the end of the stone path, the mist would grow extremely thick, and she could faintly see the outline of an easel, yet she could never get close. She guessed that was where Self-Portrait Empty Easel was hidden, the core of Vale's consciousness. And the truth behind Vale's disappearance was likely hidden in that painting. In the days that followed, Leah's dreams became more and more realistic, blurring the line between dream and reality. When she fell asleep at night, she was no longer passively trapped on the pier, but could actively move towards sounds and light. The mist was still dense, but she could make out the abandoned warehouse beside the pier, its wooden door hanging askew on its hinges, creaking in the wind, with stacked wooden crates visible inside, covered in seaweed and rust. The sound of singing from the distant theater grew clearer. It was the opera aria Celeste had once sung, its melody gentle yet tinged with lingering sorrow, drifting through the mist and tugging at her heartstrings. She walked in the direction of the singing, the mist flowing slowly beneath her feet as if guiding her. The moss underfoot gradually thinned, the stone path becoming drier, and scattered wildflowers even appeared beside the road, their petals dotted with mist droplets, yet without shadows. After walking for about half an hour, the mist lifted slightly, revealing an old studio with a wooden door ajar, warm yellow light spilling from within. She pushed the door open gently. The studio was filled with the scent of old oil paint and turpentine, exactly the same as the scent of Vale's paintings in reality. In the center of the studio stood an empty easel, with a blank canvas stretched across it, and a palette beside it holding 3 colors: red, blue, and white. The paint was still wet. When she touched it with her fingertip, she could feel its moisture, as if the artist had just put down his brush and left. The walls were covered with paintings, all works by Vale that she had seen in the museum, but each one now had a shadow. These shadows moved slowly under the light as if alive. The gentleman's shadow in morning mist at the pier shifted with the light, the actress's shadow in the theater backstage gently swayed her skirt, and the model's shadow in the portrait raised a hand to touch her cheek, strange yet carrying a flawed tenderness. Suddenly, she heard soft footsteps behind her, slow and heavy, as if stepping on thick carpet. She turned around abruptly, seeing a blurry figure standing at the studio door, shrouded in the remaining mist. He was slender, wearing a 19th century coat, his face hidden in shadow, indistinguishable. And beneath his feet, there was nothing, no shadow at all. "You're finally here," the figure said, his voice hoarse and hollow, as if coming from a great distance. Leah instinctively clutched the pocket watch in her hand. Somehow, it had appeared in her dream. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure did not answer, only raised his hand slowly, pointing to the empty easel. "The answer is there." Just as Leah was about to approach the easel, the dream shattered suddenly. She woke up to find herself sitting on the floor of the exhibition hall, the sky outside already streaked with dawn. She had no idea when she had left her house and come to the museum. She was still wearing her pajamas, the brass pocket watch clutched tightly in her hand. The exhibition hall lights were still on, and Vale's paintings glowed with an eerie luster in the light, the mist in them seeming thicker than during the day. Leah stood up and walked to the center of the exhibition hall, her gaze sweeping over all the paintings. She suddenly realized that the paintings seemed to be echoing each other, their scenes slowly merging. The mist of the pier connected to the theater backstage. The studio window faced a garden path, and all the scenes revolved around that empty easel. And self-portrait empty easel was hidden in the gap between these scenes, at the core of all Vale's works. She remembered the curator's earlier attitude, his deliberate avoidance. Perhaps he had known the truth all along. Leah immediately went to find him. When she knocked on the door of his office, the curator was flipping through an old document. At the sight of the pocket watch and diary in Leah's hands, his face turned pale. "You know everything?" the curator said, putting down the document, his tone heavy. Leah nodded. "Where is self-portrait empty easel? Is the truth behind Vale's disappearance related to that painting?" The curator fell silent for a long time, then sighed and stood up, walking to the bookshelf. He rotated a thick art history book, and the bookshelf slid open, revealing a hidden chamber. "The painting is in there," the curator said, his voice tired. "My grandfather was one of the organizers of Vale's solo exhibition. After Vale disappeared, he found this painting hidden in the wall of Vale's studio. He knew how dangerous it was, so he hid it, passing it down through the generations. It wasn't until I took over the museum that I moved it here." Leah walked into the chamber. It was small, lit only by a dim yellow light that illuminated the easel in the center. On the easel hung self-portrait, empty easel. On the canvas, an empty easel stood in the middle of a studio, with a palette and several brushes beside it, paint tubes scattered on the floor, and a blurred, misty background. Exactly the scene she had seen in her dream. The painting had no frame, its edges slightly worn, yet the oil paint still glowed brightly, as if it had just been completed. When Leah's gaze fell on the canvas, the surrounding light suddenly dimmed. The dim yellow light twisted into tiny spots, and the walls of the chamber began to melt and dissipate, replaced by suffocatingly dense mist. This time, instead of entering a hazy dream, she was pulled directly into a surreal space by an invisible force. Under her feet were the wooden planks of the pier, still creaking as she stepped, while behind her, the scene instantly shifted to the theater backstage, with a deep red curtain hanging down, dotted with tiny sequins. Exactly the scene from Vale's painting. In the distant mist, Vale's studio was faintly visible, its window facing a garden path lined with blooming roses, none of which had shadows. The end of the path connected to another pier, forming an endless loop. All the scenes she had seen in Vale's paintings were stitched together here, overlapping and intertwining to form a vast, bizarre spiritual labyrinth. Faint footsteps, whispers, and sighs drifted from all directions, their sources indistinguishable. She walked toward the sounds, the mist parting slowly around her, then closing quickly behind her, as if erasing her trace. After walking for a while, she saw a group of blurry figures ahead, wandering aimlessly in the labyrinth, their eyes empty, like soulless shells. Some held their heads in their hands, muttering fragmented words like shadow, brush, and fog. Others squatted on the ground, drawing something in the air on closer inspection, They were mimicking the outline of a shadow. Still others ran frantically into the mist, only to return to their starting point after a few steps, their faces filled with despair and collapse. Among the crowd, Leah recognized the art historian Irene. She was wearing a 1950s dress, her hair gray and messy, clutching a notebook tightly in her hand. The notebook's pages were yellowed and curled, filled with annotations about Vale's paintings, though many of the words were blurred by tears. Irene muttered repeatedly, "Where is the shadow? My shadow is gone, and the shadow in the painting is gone too." Her steps were unsteady, and she occasionally bumped into other figures, who only turned around numbly, glanced at her, and continued wandering, showing no reaction. Leah stepped forward and gently patted Irene's shoulder. Irene spun around suddenly, her eyes filled with terror and confusion, as if seeing a stranger. "Who are you? Where am I? I need to find my shadow. I still have a paper to write." Leah looked into her empty eyes, her heart aching. She said softly, "You've been trapped here for too long. Don't be afraid. I'll find a way to calm you down." But Irene seemed not to understand, pushing her away and continuing to wander in the labyrinth, still muttering about her shadow. Leah watched her retreating figure, then looked at the other trapped souls around her, suddenly realizing these people were not simply trapped. Their consciousness had been absorbed by Vale's emotional fragments, and a part of themselves had been left here forever, becoming part of the labyrinth. Their obsessions, confusions, and pains were intertwined with Vale's sorrow, repeating endlessly, with no escape. She clenched the pocket watch in her pocket, feeling a faint warmth emanating from it, as if giving her strength. She took a deep breath and walked toward the center of the labyrinth, the old studio. She knew that only by finding Vale's core consciousness could she put an end to all this. These were all scholars who had delved deeply into Vale's paintings over the past century, trapped by fragments of his consciousness. Parts of their minds were left in this labyrinth, lost forever, unable to return to reality. Leah's heart ached sharply. She clutched the pocket watch and continued walking toward the center of the labyrinth, the old studio. Inside the studio, the empty easel still stood in the center. The blurry figure was standing beside it. When he saw Leah approaching, he turned around slowly. The mist lifted slightly, and Leah finally saw his face clearly. Thin, with empty eyes, wearing a 19th century coat, surrounded by a faint glow, and no shadow beneath his feet. He was Edgar Vale, or rather, the remaining core consciousness of Vale. "You've finally found your way here." Vale's voice was still hoarse, but now carried a hint of relief. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time." Leah stopped and looked at him. "You didn't disappear. You turned yourself into art, didn't you?" Vale nodded, raising his hand to touch the empty easel. His fingertip passed through it, leaving no trace, as if he were one with the space. "By 1893, I had exhausted all my emotions," he said, his voice tinged with sorrow, his gaze falling on the palette beside the easel, as if recalling a distant past. "I had sought out countless models, absorbing their sorrow, despair, and regret, but those emotions only filled my emptiness temporarily, fading away in an instant. I grew more and more numb, more and more empty, until I could barely hold a brush. I could no longer absorb others' shadows, nor could I feel my own existence. When I looked in the mirror, I saw only a vague outline. I couldn't even find my own shadow. I realized I was about to disappear, as if I had never existed." He paused, his voice filled with both relief and pain. "All my life, I chased emotions, from Celeste's love to the trauma of others. I thought devouring others' shadows would fill my emptiness, but in the end, I realized I had never had a shadow of my own, never truly lived. Celeste said her shadow would follow my brush, but I couldn't even keep my own shadow, let alone hers." Mist swirled around him, making his figure even more transparent, as if he would dissipate at any moment. "So you chose to dissociate yourself?" Leah said softly. "Yes." Vale's figure grew even more translucent. "I poured my remaining life, memories, emotions, and the shadow I had never possessed into this painting. My consciousness shattered into countless fragments, scattered across every painting that carried the emotional shadows of others. Those who look at the paintings unconsciously step into these fragments of my consciousness, into the labyrinth of my broken mind. What they see is the sorrow and obsession of my entire life." He looked at Leah, his eyes filled with entreaty. "I created this labyrinth, but I couldn't control it. For 100 years, too many people have been trapped here. I watched their pain, but I was powerless to help. Now you have the right to choose." Vale held out his hand, and two lights appeared in his palm. A warm golden light, representing inheritance, and a cold black light, representing release. "Inherit me, become the new anchor. You can learn to control this power, maintain the existence of these consciousness labyrinths, and perhaps one day reassemble me." He paused, then continued. "Or burn this painting. It is the core of the labyrinth. Burning it will cause all the emotional radiation in the paintings to burst forth violently before dissipating. The trapped consciousness, including mine, will vanish completely, and the curse will end. But my art will lose its enchanting allure, becoming nothing more than ordinary old paintings." Leah looked at Vale's transparent figure, then at the wandering souls in the labyrinth, her heart filled with complex emotions. She sympathized with Vale's tragedy, yet resented him for trapping countless people in his obsession. If she chose to inherit, she would bear Vale's curse, forever bound to these emotional fragments. If she chose to burn the painting, she would end the curse, but also erase Vale's life's work and existence entirely. She looked down at the pocket watch in her hand, its patterns glowing faintly in the light. In the dream, the pocket watch had been a symbol of Vale's longing for Celeste. In reality, it was the link between Vale's consciousness and the real world. Suddenly, she understood. Neither inheritance nor release was the best choice. Leah looked up at Vale. "I will not inherit you, nor will I burn the painting." Vale looked stunned, his eyes filled with confusion. "Your art should not be destroyed, and the trapped consciousness should not be forgotten forever," Leah said firmly. "I will leave this painting here with the strictest viewing restrictions to prevent more people from falling into the labyrinth. I will write a guide to viewing the paintings, not an art analysis, but a spiritual protection manual, teaching people how to appreciate your beauty and sorrow without being consumed by them." Vale's figure trembled violently, mist swirling around him. His eyes were filled with shock, relief, and gratitude. You want me to exist this way?" "Yes," Leah nodded. "Your art was born from sorrow and obsession, but it is beautiful in itself. I will protect it and I will restrain it. The trapped consciousness may never return to reality, but I will stay with them, so they are no longer alone." Vale's figure gradually brightened. He bowed deeply to Leah, then shattered into countless tiny points of light, scattering across every corner of the labyrinth. The labyrinth began to collapse slowly. The wandering figures stopped and looked toward Leah, their eyes filled with peace. Leah clenched the pocket watch, and a glow emanated from it, wrapping around her and carrying her back to reality. In the chamber, the dim yellow light still shone. Self-portrait, empty easel, stood quietly on the easel, the mist on the canvas seeming to have thinned slightly. The curator stood at the chamber door, sighing with relief when he saw Leah was unharmed. "Thank goodness you're all right." Leah shook her head, walking to the easel and gently touching the canvas. "I'm fine," she said, turning to the curator. "Please have this place reinforced with strict access control. No one but me is allowed to enter. Also, I need a private office to write the viewing guide." In the days that followed, Leah busied herself with meticulous care, as if guarding a fragile treasure. She reorganized Vale's 10 relics, encasing them in special dust-proof glass, and installed small protective barriers beneath each painting, custom-made after consulting with the curator, based on her experiences in the labyrinth. These barriers could weakly block the emotional radiation emanating from the paintings, preventing unconscious onlookers from being drawn in. She also posted prominent viewing notices at the entrance of the exhibition hall, with no bizarre descriptions, only simple instructions. Do not stare at the details of the paintings for a long time. Maintain a 1-meter viewing distance. If you feel dizzy or flustered, please leave the hall immediately. She left self-portrait, empty easel, in the chamber, having the curator hire a professional team to reinforce the walls and access control with dual fingerprint and password verification. No one but her could enter. Every morning, she would spend half an hour in the chamber, sitting beside the easel, quietly looking at the painting, sometimes speaking softly to Vale's remaining consciousness, telling him about the happenings in the exhibition hall and the reactions of the viewers, as if chatting with an old friend. She also specially requested a private office with a window facing the museum's garden, allowing sunlight to shine on her desk. She placed Vale's diary, the letter, and the pocket watch on the desk and began writing the viewing guide. The guide contained no professional art criticism, only a detailed account of her experiences in the labyrinth and methods to resist emotional erosion, such as focusing on the brushwork rather than the overall atmosphere while viewing, repeating her own name silently to anchor herself in reality, and shifting her gaze immediately if she felt emotional fluctuations. She wrote every word with great care, hoping the guide would serve as a defense line, honoring Vale's art while protecting others from falling into danger. The special exhibition opened as scheduled. Vale's paintings, with their bizarre and unique, shadowless style, attracted countless art lovers and tourists. On the opening day, the exhibition hall was packed with people, all gathered around the paintings, discussing animatedly. Some marveled at the delicate brushwork, others wondered why the shadows had been deliberately erased, and still others tried to view the paintings from different angles, hoping to find flaws in the light and shadow. Leah stood in the corner of the hall, silently observing each viewer. When she saw someone unconsciously leaning closer to a painting, their eyes growing dazed, she would quietly approach and hand them a copy of the viewing guide, reminding them gently to maintain their distance. Most people would follow the advice, flipping through the guide thoughtfully before adjusting their posture and re-examining the painting, the dazed look fading from their faces. A few, however, dismissed the warning, insisting on staring at the paintings for a long time. Before long, their faces turned pale, and they stumbled out of the hall, never to return. Throughout the day, no one experienced recurring dreams, amnesia, or disorientation. A huge relief to Leah. After closing time, she returned to the chamber, looking at self-portrait, empty easel, and noticing that the mist on the canvas had thinned even more, the outline of the empty easel becoming clearer. She knew this was because the trapped emotional fragments were no longer spreading freely, and Vale's consciousness had gradually calmed. The pocket watch in her pocket grew slightly warm, as if responding to her efforts, as if Vale were expressing his gratitude. At night, Leah still dreamed of that foggy pier occasionally, but this time, she no longer lost her way. The pocket watch in her hand transformed into a small lamp, illuminating the path ahead. As she walked along the stone path, she could see Vale's figure flickering in the mist, waving gently at her. She could see Celeste standing at the theater door, smiling brightly. She could see the trapped consciousness wandering peacefully in the light, no longer in pain. The rain in Bay City still carried a briny smell, falling on the art museum's glass dome. Leah stood in the exhibition hall, looking at Vale's paintings, her heart calm. She had not inherited the curse, nor had she destroyed the art. Instead, she had found a way to coexist with the past. Edgar Vale's name would be remembered forever, along with his paintings, and she would be Bay City's most unique guardian, protecting these paintings that carried sorrow and obsession, and guarding the shadowless ones scattered in the light and shadow. The pocket watch throbbed gently in her pocket, as if it had come to life. She knew the story was not over. Her bond with Vale and these paintings would continue every foggy night, and the emotions and secrets hidden behind the canvases would gradually settle into the most touching form of art as time passed. Days passed, and Leah's viewing guide was translated into multiple languages, causing a stir in the art world. Some questioned the bizarre content of the guide, while others were able to appreciate Vale's art safely thanks to its warnings. Leah never defended herself, only coming to the museum on time every day to check the paintings, organize materials, and occasionally step into the chamber to gaze at self-portrait, empty easel. For a moment, one weekend afternoon, sunlight streamed through the glass dome, casting dappled light on the exhibition hall floor. An elderly man with white hair stood in front of Vale's morning mist at the pier, lingering for a long time. Leah approached, noticing the familiar sorrow in his eyes, and immediately handed him a copy of the viewing guide. "Sir, these are the viewing precautions. They might be helpful to you." The old man took the guide, flipped through a few pages, and looked up at Leah, his eyes filled with surprise. You know the secret in the painting?" Leah nodded, saying no more. The old man sighed softly. "My grandmother was one of the scholars trapped by Vale's paintings. She had that lost dream all her life, muttering about the foggy pier until the day she died." Leah fell silent for a moment, then said gently, "She is at peace now." The old man stared at her for a moment, then understood, tears sliding down his cheeks. "Thank you, child. After all these years, I can finally rest easy." After the old man left, Leah stood in front of morning mist at the pier, looking at the mist in the painting. Sunlight passed through the canvas, casting a faint shadow on the floor, a shadow of the painting itself, and a trace of all the redeemed emotions left in time. She knew Vale's obsession might not have fully faded, but at the very least, those who had suffered because of him had finally found peace. The sea breeze blew through the museum's windows, carrying a briny scent, stirring Leah's hair. She reached into her pocket and touched the pocket watch, its case warm, as if still retaining Vale's temperature. She smiled and turned toward the chamber. The empty easel still stood there, the mist on the canvas having thinned a little more. Perhaps one day, when all emotions were resolved, Vale's consciousness would reassemble, returning to the world he had cherished for 100 years in another form. Until then, she would keep guarding here, protecting these shadowless paintings, and guarding every foggy morning in Bay City.